The gunshot echoed across the sunburnt plains of Nevada Territory, 1875, causing Mason Vance to drop to the ground by instinct, his hand automatically reaching for the Colt revolver at his hip. At 32, his reflexes remained sharp despite having hung up his deputy badge 3 years prior. Raising his head cautiously, he spotted the source, just a rancher taking aim at a coyote that had been stalking his chickens. Mason exhaled, dusted off his denim pants, and continued his journey into Las Vegas, a dusty outpost town still finding its footing in the harsh desert landscape. The sun beat down mercilessly as Mason guided his chestnut stallion, Thunder, toward town. His face, weathered beyond his years from long days under the unforgiving sun, bore the quiet resignation of a man who had made peace with his solitude. The doctor's words from 5 years ago still echoed in his mind. "The fever damaged too much, Mr. Vance. You'll never father children." Those words had cost him his engagement to Emily Winters, whose dreams of a large family couldn't accommodate a barren husband. Mason had built his ranch 10 miles outside of Las Vegas, keeping mostly to himself, except for necessary supply runs and occasional social obligations. The townsfolk respected him, a former lawman who'd helped establish order in the early days, but they also whispered about the lonely cowboy, whose sprawling ranch house seemed too large for just one man. As he approached town, the usual sounds greeted him: piano music drifting from the Silver Dollar Saloon, the blacksmith's hammer striking hot iron, and the general chatter of a town coming to life in the mid-morning hours. Mason tipped his hat to Sheriff Hank Parsons, who nodded in return from his position on the jailhouse porch. "Supplies today, Mason," the sheriff called out. "That and checking the post," Mason replied, dismounting and tying Thunder to the hitching post outside Wilcox's general store. "Any news worth knowing?" Sheriff Parsons sighed heavily, his gray mustache drooping. "Train robbery 3 counties over, and the orphanage over in Carson City burned down 2 nights ago." Mason paused mid-step. "Anyone hurt?" "Couple of the nuns, nothing fatal. Children all got out, thank the Lord, but they're scrambling to place them. Some being sent our way, I hear." Mason nodded solemnly before entering the general store. The familiar smell of coffee, leather, and dried goods greeted him as the door's bell jingled. Old Mr. Wilcox stood behind the counter, arguing with a woman Mason had never seen before. She stood tall and proud in a simple but clean blue dress, her chestnut hair pulled back in a practical bun, though wisps had escaped to frame a face flushed with frustration. 3 children huddled behind her skirts, 2 boys and a girl, all with tired eyes and dirty faces. "Madam, I understand your situation, but I can't extend credit to someone just arrived in town," Wilcox was saying. "I've got a business to run." "I'm not asking for charity, sir," the woman replied, her voice strained but dignified. "I'm asking for a reasonable arrangement until I receive my first wages from the schoolhouse. These children need to eat tonight." Mason watched as the smallest boy, probably no more than 4 years old, peered out from behind the woman's skirts with wide, fearful eyes. Something in that gaze tugged at Mason, a sensation he couldn't quite name settling in his chest. "Everything all right here, Wilcox?" Mason asked, stepping forward. Both the storekeeper and the woman turned to him. Wilcox's expression relaxed at the sight of a familiar customer while the woman eyed Mason warily. "Mason Vance," he said, tipping his hat to her. "Couldn't help overhearing." "Katherine Davis," she replied with a slight nod. "And no, everything is not all right. I've accepted the teaching position in town and arrived with these 3 orphans from Carson City, only to find the promised boarding arrangements fell through." Now Mr. Wilcox here won't allow us basic necessities until payday. Mason considered the situation. The smallest boy had emerged further from behind Katherine's skirts, staring at Mason with curiosity now rather than fear. The middle child, a girl of maybe 8, kept her eyes downcast, while the oldest boy, probably 10, had positioned himself protectively near the others. "Put whatever Mrs. Davis needs on my account, Wilcox," Mason said, making a sudden decision that surprised even himself. Katherine's eyes widened. "That's very generous, Mr. Vance, but I can't accept. It's just Mason. And it's not charity, it's a loan. You can settle up when you get paid." He turned to Wilcox. "That acceptable?" The storekeeper nodded, though reluctantly. "Your credit's good here, Mason." Katherine hesitated, pride warring with practicality on her face before she finally nodded. "Thank you, Mr. Vance. I'll repay every cent." As Katherine selected basic supplies, flour, beans, salt pork, and a few apples for the children, Mason completed his own shopping. The children remained quiet but watchful, especially the oldest boy, who kept shooting suspicious glances Mason's way. At the counter, Mason asked casually, "Where are you staying now that your arrangements fell through?" Katherine sighed as she watched Wilcox tally her modest purchases. "The church has offered their meeting room temporarily. It's not ideal, but we'll manage." Mason nodded, considering his next words carefully. His ranch house had 5 bedrooms built when he still harbored dreams of filling them with family. Now they sat empty, gathering dust. "I have room," he said simply. "At my ranch, it's about 10 miles out, but it's clean and sitting empty. You'd have privacy, separate wing of the house entirely." Katherine's eyes narrowed. "That's very unusual to offer to strangers, Mr. Vance." "Mason," he corrected again. "And yes, it is. But I was deputy here for 7 years. Sheriff Parsons can vouch for me. The town's short on housing, especially with the silver boom bringing in new folks." The oldest boy tugged at Katherine's sleeve. "Miss Davis, I don't think it's all right, Thomas," she said gently, though her eyes remained assessing as she studied Mason. "Mr. Vance, while I appreciate the offer, I don't know you." Mason nodded, respecting her caution. "Ask around town about me. I'll finish my errands and be at the Silver Dollar for lunch. If you decide you'd rather not sleep on church benches with 3 children, I'll be heading back around too." He tipped his hat again, paid Wilcox for his supplies, and left the store, aware of 4 pairs of eyes following him out. Mason completed his errands methodically. Mail collected, farming supplies ordered, a brief discussion with the blacksmith about shoeing thunder. All the while, his mind kept returning to the schoolteacher and the 3 orphans. He couldn't explain even to himself why he'd made such an offer. Perhaps it was the empty rooms haunting him, or maybe the look in that small boy's eyes. Whatever the reason, he found himself hoping she would accept. The Silver Dollar served decent food despite its reputation as a saloon, and Mason was halfway through a plate of beef stew when the batwing doors swung open. Katherine Davis entered, her posture straight and determined, the 3 children trailing behind her. She spotted him and made her way to his table. "The sheriff speaks highly of you," she said without preamble, "as does Reverend Peters and Mrs. Holbrook at the post office." Mason nodded, gesturing to the empty chairs. "Hungry? The stew's good." Katherine hesitated before sitting down, helping the smallest boy onto the chair beside her. The other 2 children followed reluctantly. "We've already eaten, thank you. A simple lunch at the church." "Mason Vance," he said, offering his hand to the oldest boy first. "Didn't catch your names earlier." The boy stared at the offered hand before slowly taking it. "Thomas Reeves. That's my sister Sarah, and the little one is James." Mason shook each child's hand in turn, noting how tiny James's fingers felt in his calloused palm. "Pleased to meet you all properly." "Mr. Vance," Katherine began. "Mason," he corrected automatically. "Mason," she conceded with the ghost of a smile. "I've considered your offer. Before accepting, I need to understand your terms and your motivations." Mason appreciated her directness. "No special terms. The house has space you need. You're welcome to stay until you find something more suitable in town. As for motivation..." He paused, considering how much to reveal to this stranger. "I built that house for a family that never happened. Seems a waste to let rooms sit empty when they're needed." Something in his tone must have conveyed his sincerity because Katherine's posture relaxed slightly. "Very well. We accept your offer temporarily until I can secure proper accommodation in town." Mason nodded, feeling oddly relieved. "We can head out whenever you're ready." "Do you have belongings to collect?" "Just a few trunks at the church. Everything else was lost in the fire." An hour later, Mason had loaded Katherine's trunks into his wagon. Thomas sat up front with Mason, while Katherine and the younger children settled in the back among the supplies. As they left town behind, the vastness of the desert spread before them, the distant mountains purple against the horizon. "You have cattle?" Thomas asked, breaking the silence. "Some. Mostly I breed and train horses. Can I learn to ride?" The question came quickly, followed by an embarrassed look as if the boy regretted showing enthusiasm. "If your guardian permits," Mason replied carefully, glancing back at Katherine, who was listening intently. "Proper riding's a useful skill out here." "We'll see," Katherine said noncommittally, though Mason noticed she didn't outright refuse. The journey passed with sporadic conversation. Mason learned that Katherine had been a teacher in Carson City before the orphanage fire. The children had been in her care for varying lengths of time, Thomas and Sarah for nearly a year, little James for only 3 months. All had lost their parents to different tragedies. Disease for Thomas and Sarah's, a mining accident for James's. The Las Vegas school board was desperate for a qualified teacher, Katherine explained. "When they heard about the fire, they offered to take me and 3 of the orphans immediately. The arrangements were supposed to include housing." "Board members making promises they can't keep," Mason commented. "Some things never change." As they crested a small rise, Mason's ranch came into view. The main house stood 2 stories tall, constructed of solid timber with a wide front porch. Nearby stood a barn, bunkhouse, corral, and various outbuildings, all well maintained. "You live here alone?" Sarah asked, speaking for the first time since they'd left town. "I have a couple of ranch hands who bunk in the outbuilding, but they're driving some horses to the army post in Arizona. Won't be back for a few weeks." He noticed Katherine's slight frown. "Meaning we're alone out here. Nearest neighbors 3 miles east," Mason confirmed, understanding her concern. "But I give you my word as a former lawman, you and the children will be safe here." As they pulled up to the house, little James pointed excitedly. "Horsies." Several horses grazed in the nearby pasture, their coats gleaming in the afternoon sun. The boy's excitement seemed to break some of the tension, and even Thomas looked impressed by the animals. Mason helped them unload, carrying the trunks into the house. The east wing had 4 bedrooms connected by a hallway, with a small sitting area at one end. "You can arrange yourselves however you like," he said, setting down the last trunk. "There's a washroom at the end of the hall. Pump brings water right inside." Katherine ran her hand over a dust-free sideboard, clearly surprised by the cleanliness. "You keep a tidy home for a bachelor, Mr. Vance." "Hard habit to break," he said with a shrug. "My mother insisted on proper housekeeping." He showed them the kitchen and pantry, explaining the basic workings of the house before excusing himself to tend to the horses. "Make yourselves at home. Supper's usually at 6, but we can adjust." Outside in the fresh air, Mason questioned his impulsive decision. He'd lived alone for years, comfortable with his solitude. Now he had 4 strangers under his roof, a schoolteacher and 3 orphans. What had he been thinking? The answer came when he glanced back at the house and saw little James's face pressed against the window, watching him with undisguised fascination. Something about that child's gaze reached places in Mason's heart he'd thought long closed off. Mason spent the next hour working with a spirited yearling in the corral, aware of his audience at the window. Eventually, the boy disappeared, only to reappear minutes later standing outside the corral fence, Katherine close behind him. "James was insistent on watching more closely," she explained. "I hope we're not disturbing your work." "Not at all," Mason replied, leading the yearling in a circle. "I'm just getting her used to the feel of a lead rope. First step before saddle training." "She's pretty," James said, his small fingers gripping the lower rail of the fence. "Her name's Starlight," Mason said, bringing the young horse closer so James could see. "Named for that white mark on her forehead." James's eyes widened as the horse snuffed curiously in his direction. "Can I touch her?" Mason looked to Katherine, who hesitated before nodding. "Carefully hold out your hand palm flat," Mason instructed, keeping a firm hold on Starlight's rope. "Let her smell you first." James followed directions perfectly, giggling when the horse's soft muzzle tickled his palm. "She likes me, she does," Mason agreed, surprised by the warmth spreading through his chest at the boy's delight. "You have a gentle touch. Horses appreciate that." Katherine watched the interaction with an unreadable expression. When Mason caught her eye, she offered a small smile. "I should start supper preparations. What time do you typically eat?" "Don't trouble yourself tonight," Mason said. "I have a stew started in the Dutch oven, part of my Saturday routine." Her eyebrows rose slightly. "You cook as well." "Nothing fancy, but I manage." "Man can't live on beef jerky alone, much as I've tried." The comment earned him a genuine laugh, transforming Katherine's face. Mason found himself momentarily struck by how the simple sound brightened her features, bringing warmth to her green eyes. "Very well," she said. "But tomorrow I insist on contributing. I won't have us be complete burdens." "We'll work something out," Mason agreed. "For now, feel free to rest or explore. Supper in about an hour." That evening, the 5 of them gathered around Mason's dining table for the first time. The stew beef with potatoes, carrots, and onions was simple but filling. Mason had added corn bread at the last minute, remembering the children might appreciate it. The meal began in awkward silence, but gradually conversation emerged. Sarah asked about the books visible on Mason's shelves, lighting up when he mentioned several children's titles left from his own childhood. Thomas remained reserved, but showed interest when Mason mentioned the ranch's operations. James, the least inhibited, peppered Mason with questions about the horses until Katherine gently reminded him to eat. "Have you lived here long, Mr. Vance?" Katherine asked as she helped James cut his meat. "Built the place 7 years ago," Mason replied. "And please, it's just Mason." "7 years," she echoed. "That's a long time to maintain such a large house alone." Mason shrugged, not ready to explain about Emily and his shattered plans for a family. Had dreams of expanding the operation, never quite happened that way. After supper, Katherine insisted on helping with the dishes despite Mason's protests. The children were settled in the sitting room, Thomas reading aloud from one of Mason's old books while Sarah listened, and James played with some carved wooden animals Mason had found in a trunk. "They seem to be settling in," Mason observed as he dried a plate, Katherine nodded, her hands submerged in the soapy water. They've learned to adapt quickly. It's a necessary skill when you've lost everything once already. And you, have you always worked with orphans? She shook her head, passing him another clean plate. I taught at a regular school in Carson City until last year. When the orphanage needed a teacher, I volunteered. Then, when I saw how overwhelmed they were, I started staying longer hours than overnight sometimes. She shrugged. Eventually, it made more sense to move in completely. That's quite a commitment. They needed someone, she said simply, and I had no family tying me elsewhere. Mason studied her profile as she concentrated on scrubbing a stubborn pot. She couldn't be older than 28 or 29, yet she carried herself with the confidence and determination of someone who had faced significant challenges. No husband waiting at home. Katherine's hands stilled momentarily. My fiancé died in a mining accident 3 years ago. I'm sorry, Mason said, genuinely contrite at bringing up what was clearly still painful. Life continues, she replied pragmatically. And these children needed someone to advocate for them when the orphanage burned. Her voice caught slightly. I couldn't bear the thought of them being separated. The school board here agreed to take 3 with me, but the others. She cleared her throat. The others were sent to various places. I can only hope they found good homes. Mason nodded, understanding the weight of such responsibility. You've done more than most would. Yet never enough, she murmured, almost to herself. Later that night, after the house had grown quiet and the children were asleep, Mason sat on his front porch nursing a small glass of whiskey. The desert night had turned cool, stars blazing overhead in a clarity only found far from city lights. He was contemplating turning in when the front door opened quietly, and Katherine stepped out. I hope I'm not intruding, she said, wrapped in a shawl against the evening chill. Not at all, Mason replied, standing to offer her the rocking chair. Trouble sleeping, new surroundings, she said, settling into the chair, and much to think about. Mason resumed his seat on the porch step, giving her space. It's peaceful out here at night, good for thinking. They sat in companionable silence for a while, the only sounds the distant coyote calls and the gentle creaking of Katherine's rocking chair. I want to thank you properly, she finally said. What you did today was uncommonly kind, especially to strangers. Mason shrugged, uncomfortable with the gratitude. Seemed the right thing to do. Nevertheless, it was unexpected. Most men wouldn't open their home to a woman and 3 children they've just met. Most men haven't built a house for ghosts, Mason replied before he could stop himself. The whiskey had loosened his tongue more than he intended. Katherine's rocking paused. Ghosts, Mason sighed, deciding honesty was simpler than evasion. I built this house for a family I planned to have with my fiancé. When that ended, I kept building anyway. Stubborn, I guess. What happened? If you don't mind my asking. Mason stared out at the moonlit landscape. Found out I couldn't father children. Medical condition after a bad fever. Emily, my fiancée, she wanted a big family more than she wanted me. The admission hung in the night air between them. Mason rarely spoke of it, having buried the hurt years ago, or so he'd thought. I'm sorry, Katherine said softly. That must have been devastating. Mason nodded once sharply. It was, but life continues, as you said. Yes, it does, she resumed, rocking gently. Though rarely in the direction we expect. The next morning, Mason woke to unfamiliar sounds, children's voices, light footsteps, the clatter of dishes. For a disorienting moment, he wondered if he was dreaming, before remembering his house guests. He dressed quickly and found Katherine in the kitchen, already preparing breakfast. I hope you don't mind, she said when she spotted him. I wanted to contribute something. Smells better than my usual fare, Mason admitted, pouring himself coffee from the pot she'd already brewed. Thomas and Sarah sat at the kitchen table, the boy whittling a piece of wood while the girl carefully brushed her hair. Little James was nowhere to be seen. "Where's the youngest?" Mason asked, suddenly concerned. Katherine smiled, nodding toward the window. "He woke with the sun, desperate to see the horses again." Mason followed her gaze to see James standing by the corral fence, watching the horses with rapt attention. The boy was still in his nightshirt, his feet bare on the morning damp grass. "He'll catch cold," Mason said, heading for the door. He found James talking softly to Starlight, who had approached the fence curiously. The boy barely noticed Mason's arrival, so intent was he on the horse. "She remembers me," James said with certainty. "Appears she does," Mason agreed, crouching beside the boy. "But you need proper clothes and shoes before horse watching, young man. Ground's cold this early." James looked down at his bare feet as if just noticing them. "Oh, come on," Mason said, surprising himself by lifting the boy onto his shoulders. "Let's get you dressed, and after breakfast, maybe we can give Starlight a proper greeting." James's small hands gripped Mason's hair. "Really? Can I feed her?" "If you eat all your breakfast first," Mason bargained, carrying the lightweight child back to the house. Katherine met them at the door with clothes for James, her expression softening at the sight of the boy perched happily on Mason's shoulders. "I see you've made a friend," she remarked, helping James down. "Mason said I can feed Starlight after breakfast if I eat everything. Did he now?" Katherine raised an eyebrow at Mason, who shrugged unapologetically. "Horses need attention," he said simply. "James has a natural way with them." The next few days established a rhythm. Katherine insisted on sharing household duties, cooking breakfast while Mason handled dinner. The children gradually relaxed, exploring the ranch under Mason's watchful eye. Thomas showed interest in Mason's workshop, where he repaired tack and crafted simple furniture. Sarah discovered Mason's small library and spent hours reading on the porch swing. And James shadowed Mason everywhere, absorbing everything about horses with an intensity that surprised everyone. On the fourth morning, Mason found Katherine at the kitchen table reviewing papers. "School preparations?" he asked, pouring his coffee. She nodded. "Classes begin Monday." "I should move us to town before then." Mason felt an unexpected pang at the thought. "The roads are good, you could commute." Katherine looked up, studying him. "That's a long journey twice daily." "I go to town regular anyway," Mason said, trying to sound casual. "Could drop you and pick you up." "That's very generous, but we've imposed enough already." Mason sat across from her. "It's no imposition. The children seem settled here. Might be easier than uprooting them again so soon." Katherine set down her pen. "Mason, what are you suggesting exactly?" "Just that you stay through the school term. By summer, you'll have saved enough for proper accommodations in town." He hesitated, then added, "And the children seem happy here." It was true. In just a few days, all 3 orphans had blossomed in the open spaces of the ranch. Thomas had stopped flinching at sudden movements. Sarah had begun humming as she helped with chores, and James had transformed entirely, his natural exuberance emerging in full force. Katherine considered Mason's words. "We should pay rent if we stay." "Not necessary." "It absolutely is." Her tone brooked no argument. "I won't teach these children to accept charity when they should work for what they need." Mason recognized the pride driving her stance. "All right, we can work something out." Katherine nodded, satisfied. "I'll need to go to town today to finalize preparations at the schoolhouse." "I'll take you," Mason offered. "Need to check on a feed order anyway." The trip to Las Vegas that day marked a turning point. As Mason drove the wagon with Katherine beside him and the children in the back, Several townsfolk noted their arrival with curious glances. By midday, Mason could feel the weight of speculation following them through town. Sheriff Parsons cornered him outside the feed store. "Taking in strays, Mason?" he asked good-naturedly. "Temporary arrangement," Mason replied, though the words felt hollow even to his own ears. "MMHMM," the sheriff hummed skeptically. "Saw you with the little one at the mercantile. Boy looks at you like you hung the moon." Mason shrugged uncomfortably. It was true that James had become especially attached, following Mason like a shadow and asking endless questions. The child's trust both warmed and terrified him. "They'll be moving to town eventually," Mason insisted. "If you say so," Parsons replied, clearly unconvinced. "Just never thought I'd see the day Mason Vance played family man." Mason bristled at the comment but let it pass. It wasn't worth arguing, especially when a small part of him recognized the truth in it. Somehow, in just a few days, his quiet, orderly life had been upended, and surprisingly, he didn't mind. When they gathered by the wagon to return home, Mason noticed Katherine's troubled expression. "Everything all right?" he asked as he helped her up to the seat. "Just town gossip," she replied quietly. "Apparently we're the subject of considerable speculation." Mason nodded grimly. "Sheriff mentioned something similar. They're saying inappropriate things about our arrangement. People always talk, especially when there's nothing better to do." Katherine glanced back at the children, ensuring they couldn't overhear. "They're saying I've set my cap for you, that I'm using the children to secure a husband." Mason nearly dropped the reins in surprise. "That's ridiculous." "Is it?" Katherine challenged. "A single woman and 3 orphans moving in with an unmarried rancher. What would you think?" Mason had no good answer. From an outside perspective, he supposed it did look unusual. "Does it bother you, what they're saying?" "I've endured worse gossip," she replied with dignity. "I'm more concerned about how it affects the children, and your reputation." "My reputation can withstand a few rumors," Mason assured her. "As for the children, we know the truth. That's what matters." The truth was more complicated than either of them acknowledged. Over the following weeks, as Katherine began teaching and settled into a routine of daily trips to town, the temporary arrangement began feeling increasingly permanent. The children thrived under the combination of Katherine's steady guidance and Mason's quiet support. Thomas discovered a talent for woodworking under Mason's tutelage. Sarah blossomed when Mason built her a small garden plot of her own. And James flourished most of all. The little boy's connection with Starlight strengthened daily. Mason began teaching him simple horsemanship, how to approach safely, how to offer treats, how to read equine body language. Katherine worried initially but relaxed when she saw Mason's careful attention to safety. "He's never taken to anything like this," she remarked one evening as they watched James brush Starlight under Mason's supervision. "Not since I've known him, anyway." "Some people have natural affinities," Mason replied. "James understands horses instinctively." They stood side by side at the corral fence, close enough that Mason could detect the faint lavender scent of Katherine's soap. These quiet moments had become increasingly common and increasingly precious to Mason. "You've been good for all of them," Katherine said softly. "Especially James. He's changed so much since we arrived." "He just needed space to be himself," Mason suggested, "and something to care about." "I think he needed you," Katherine corrected gently. Mason glanced at her, surprised by the comment and the warmth in her eyes as she spoke. Something unspoken passed between them, a current of understanding that made Mason's heart beat faster. The moment broke when James called out excitedly, "Mason, look, she's following me without the lead." "Well done, James." Mason called back, grateful for the distraction from his confusing thoughts about Katherine. As autumn approached, the temporary arrangement showed no signs of ending. Katherine had established herself as an excellent teacher, earning the respect of even the most skeptical town parents. Mason expanded his workshop to accommodate Thomas's growing interest in carpentry. The ranch house, once echoing with emptiness, now bustled with life. Yet neither Mason nor Katherine spoke directly about the future. Each seemed content to let the arrangement continue day by day, neither willing to disrupt the fragile harmony they'd established. The first significant challenge came in mid-October, when 3 men appeared at the ranch late one afternoon. Mason was working with a difficult horse in the corral while Katherine helped Sarah with reading on the porch. James was feeding chickens nearby, and Thomas was repairing a fence with skills Mason had taught him. The riders approached slowly but deliberately, their intent manner immediately putting Mason on alert. He recognized the leader, Frank Denton, a wealthy cattle rancher from the next county with a reputation for aggressive business practices. Mason Vance. Denton called out, stopping his horse at the corral fence. "That's me," Mason confirmed, securing his horse before approaching the men. He was acutely aware of Katherine watching from the porch, her posture tense. "Heard you might have horses for sale." "Army's paying good prices since those Apaches started raiding again down south." "I might," Mason replied cautiously. "Depends on the horses and the price." Denton dismounted, his gaze sweeping over the ranch, lingering on Katherine and the children. "Nice setup you've got here." "Didn't know you had a family, Vance." The comment carried an undercurrent Mason didn't like. "What can I help you with, Denton?" The rancher smiled thinly. "Just business. Mind if we look at your stock?" Mason hesitated but knew refusing would only create problems. "This way," he said, leading them toward the pasture where his best horses grazed. As they walked, Denton fell in beside Mason. "Town's talking about your situation," he said quietly. "Woman and kids living here without the benefit of marriage doesn't seem proper." Mason kept his expression neutral. "My arrangements are my business, Denton." Sure, the man agreed with false joviality. "Just saying folks notice things, especially when there's a schoolteacher involved. Some parents might get concerned." The threat was thinly veiled. Mason stopped walking, turning to face Denton directly. "You came to look at horses. Let's stick to that." The tension between them was palpable as Mason showed the men his stock. Denton made a low offer on 3 horses, which Mason declined. The negotiation became increasingly strained until Denton finally mounted up, his expression cold. "Think about my offer, Vance, and your situation. Things have a way of getting complicated when a man doesn't keep his affairs respectable." After they'd ridden away, Katherine approached Mason, her face grave. "What was that about?" Mason hesitated, not wanting to worry her. "Just business." "I heard enough to know it wasn't just business," she countered. "He was making threats about our living arrangement." Mason sighed, unable to deny it. "Denton's an opportunist. He wants my horses cheap and thought he could pressure me." "Using me and the children as leverage," Katherine concluded. Her expression hardened. "I should move us to town immediately." "No," Mason said, the word coming out more forcefully than he intended. "That's exactly what he wants, to disrupt things here. I won't give him the satisfaction." Katherine studied his face. "This could affect my position at the school if parents complain." "Let them," Mason replied, surprising himself with his vehemence. "We're not doing anything wrong. The children are happy and healthy. You're an excellent teacher. What happens on my ranch is nobody's business but ours." The determination in his voice seemed to reassure her somewhat. "And what exactly is happening on your ranch, Mason?" she asked softly. The question caught him off guard. "What do you mean?" I mean, this arrangement was supposed to be temporary. It's been nearly 2 months. Mason looked around at what his ranch had become. Thomas working confidently on the fence, Sarah reading on the porch swing, James chattering to the chickens. Then back to Katherine, whose presence had somehow become essential to his days. "I don't want it to be temporary anymore," he admitted, the truth finally spoken aloud. Katherine's eyes widened slightly. "What are you saying, Mason?" Before he could answer, James came running up, clutching a perfect egg he'd found in the henhouse. The moment of revelation passed, but something had shifted between them, a recognition of feelings that could no longer be ignored. That evening, after the children were asleep, Mason found Katherine on the porch again, wrapped in her shawl against the autumn chill. "About what I said earlier," he began, settling beside her. "You don't need to explain," she said quickly. "I understand the circumstances are complicated." "That's not it," Mason countered. "The circumstances are actually very simple. I've grown attached to all of you." The thought of this house being empty again. He shook his head. "I don't want to go back to that." Katherine was quiet for a long moment. "The children have grown attached to you too, especially James. I worry about what will happen when we eventually leave." "Then don't leave," Mason said simply. "What are you suggesting, Mason? That we continue this unusual arrangement indefinitely? The town already talks. Let them talk." Mason took a deep breath. "Or we could give them something else to talk about." Katherine turned to face him fully, her expression questioning. "Marry me," Mason said, the words surprising even himself with their suddenness. "Not right away," he added hastily, seeing her shocked expression. "But eventually, when you're ready, if you're ready." Katherine stared at him, speechless. "I know it seems sudden," Mason continued, rushing to fill the silence. "And I know I can't offer you children of your own, but I care for you, Katherine, more than I thought possible after Emily. And those 3 children inside, I care for them too, deeply." "Mason," Katherine finally spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "Are you proposing because you care for me, or because you want to keep the children here?" The question struck at Mason's deepest fear, that he was substituting one dream for another, trying to create a family any way he could. But as he looked into Katherine's eyes, he knew the truth. "I'm proposing because the thought of you leaving makes everything inside me hurt," he said honestly. "The children are part of it, yes, I won't deny that, but it's you, Katherine. You've brought something back to life in me that I thought was gone forever." Katherine's eyes glistened with unshed tears. "I need time, Mason. This is unexpected." "Take all the time you need," he assured her. "I'll be here." The weeks that followed were charged with unspoken possibility. Katherine hadn't accepted Mason's proposal, but she hadn't rejected it either. They continued their daily routines while the question hung between them, coloring every interaction with new significance. November brought colder weather and the first dusting of snow to the high desert. Mason worked with Thomas to reinforce the barn and outbuildings for winter, while Katherine taught Sarah more advanced cooking skills. James spent every spare moment with the horses, his natural ability growing under Mason's careful instruction. One crisp Sunday morning, Mason took all 3 children riding Thomas on a steady gelding, Sarah on a gentle mare, and James riding double with Mason on Thunder. Katherine watched from the porch, waving as they set off across the ranch lands. "Not too far," she called. "Dinner at 1 o'clock." Mason led them to a small rise overlooking the property, where they dismounted to rest the horses. The children had grown more confident outdoors, learning the rhythms of ranch life under his guidance. "Is this all your land?" Thomas asked, surveying the expansive landscape. "As far as that ridge," Mason confirmed, pointing. "About 2,000 acres, not the biggest spread around, but enough for what I need." "It's beautiful," Sarah said softly, her usual reserve melting as she took in the vista. "Will we stay here forever?" James asked suddenly, his small face serious as he looked up at Mason. The question caught Mason off guard. "Well, that depends on Miss Davis," he answered carefully. "And what she decides is best for all of you." James frowned, processing this information. "But you want us to stay, right?" Mason crouched to the boy's level. "Yes, James, I want you to stay very much." James nodded solemnly. "Good, because I don't want to leave the horses. Or you." The simple honesty of a child, Mason thought as they remounted and headed back toward the house. If only adult decisions could be so straightforward. They were about halfway home when James, riding in front of Mason, suddenly pointed toward the house. "Something's wrong. There's smoke." Mason looked up sharply. Black smoke rose from the direction of the ranch house, too much smoke for a normal chimney. His heart clenched with fear. "Thomas, take James on your horse," he ordered, lifting the younger boy onto his brother's mount. "Ride straight to the Prescott Ranch east of here. Tell them there's trouble." "Sarah, you go with them." "But what about Miss Davis?" Sarah protested. "I'm going to her now," Mason assured them, already turning Thunder toward home. "Go quickly and stay together." He didn't wait to see if they obeyed, spurring Thunder into a gallop toward the ominous smoke. As he crested the final rise, his worst fears were confirmed. The barn was fully ablaze, flames leaping high into the clear autumn sky. Of the ranch house, he could see no immediate damage, but smoke billowed from behind it. "Katherine!" he shouted as he raced into the yard, leaping from Thunder before the horse had fully stopped. There was no answer. Mason ran toward the house, heart pounding in his chest. The back door stood open, but Katherine was nowhere to be seen. Then he heard a scream from inside the burning barn. Without hesitation, Mason ran toward the inferno. The heat hit him like a wall as he approached, but he could hear Katherine's voice calling for help from inside. The main doors were blocked by fallen, burning timbers, so he circled to the side entrance, pulling his bandana over his face against the smoke. "Katherine!" he yelled, pushing through the door into a world of heat and darkness. "Mason, here!" He followed her voice through the smoke, finding her trapped beneath a fallen support beam. The fire hadn't reached this corner yet, but it was advancing quickly. "My leg," she gasped as he knelt beside her. "I can't move it." Mason assessed the situation rapidly. The beam was heavy but not impossible to lift. "When I raise this, you need to pull yourself out immediately," he instructed. "Ready," Katherine nodded, her face streaked with soot but determined. Mason braced himself, summoning all his strength to lift the beam just enough for Katherine to drag herself free. The moment she was clear, he let the beam drop and gathered her into his arms. "Can you walk?" he asked urgently, aware of the fire's rapid approach. "I think it's broken," she admitted, wincing as she tried to put weight on her leg. Without further discussion, Mason lifted her, carrying her toward the side door they'd entered through. The smoke had thickened significantly, making it nearly impossible to see. Mason relied on memory and instinct, moving as quickly as he dared with Katherine in his arms. They were almost at the door when a burning rafter crashed down beside them, sending up a shower of sparks and cutting off their exit. Mason turned, seeking another way out as Katherine clung to his neck, her breathing labored from the smoke. "There," she pointed weakly toward a small window on the opposite wall. Mason carried her there, setting her down gently to break the glass with his elbow. He cleared the frame of shards, then lifted Katherine through first before climbing out himself. They collapsed on the ground a safe distance from the barn, coughing and gasping in the clean air. "The children," Katherine said between coughs. "Where are they?" "I sent them for help," Mason assured her, checking her leg. It was badly swollen but not bleeding. "What happened, Katherine?" Before she could answer, the sound of approaching horses reached them. Mason tensed, expecting the Prescott Ranch hands, but instead saw Frank Denton and his men riding into the yard. "Looks like you've had some bad luck, Vance," Denton called, dismounting casually. "Barn fires can be so destructive." The implication was clear in his tone. Mason stood protectively in front of Katherine. "You did this," he stated flatly. Denton shrugged, making no effort to deny it. "Accidents happen, especially when people don't heed warnings. The sheriff will have you arrested for this," Katherine said fiercely from the ground. Denton laughed. "For what? Being a good neighbor who came to help when we saw smoke. Besides, no one was hurt." His eyes narrowed. Yet, Mason sized up the situation quickly. 3 armed men against him, with Katherine injured. The children were safely away, but the threat was clear. "What do you want, Denton?" Mason demanded. "Same as before. Your best horses at half their value, and maybe that nice parcel of grazing land bordering my property." Denton smiled coldly. "Seems a fair price for ensuring no further accidents befall your unusual family arrangement." Mason's hands clenched into fists. "You're not getting my land or my horses." "Then perhaps I'll just have a word with the school board about their teacher's living situation," Denton threatened. "I'm sure they'd be interested to know." He never finished the sentence. A rifle shot cracked through the air, the bullet striking the ground at Denton's feet. All heads turned toward the source. Thomas stood at the edge of the property, Mason's Winchester rifle steady in his hands. Behind him came Sheriff Parsons and several men from the Prescott Ranch. "That's far enough, Denton," the sheriff called, riding forward with his own weapon drawn. "The boy told us everything. How you threatened Miss Davis when she was alone, tried to set fire to the house, and she ran to the barn to release the horses." Mason looked at Katherine in shock. "He came here while I was gone with the children," she nodded grimly. "He said he'd burn everything if we didn't leave. When I refused, he set fire to the back porch. I ran to free the horses, but part of the loft collapsed on me." Sheriff Parsons had reached them now, his rifle trained on Denton. "Frank Denton, you're under arrest for arson and attempted murder." "You can't prove anything," Denton snarled, though his confidence had clearly faltered. "3 children saw you riding away and then returning," the sheriff countered. "And Miss Davis's testimony will be more than enough for a jury." What followed was a flurry of activity. The Prescott Ranch hands helped control the barn fire before it could spread to the house. Katherine was examined by Mrs. Prescott, who had some medical knowledge and confirmed the leg was broken but could be set. Denton and his men were disarmed and taken into custody, their protests falling on deaf ears. Through it all, Mason was struck by one overwhelming realization: how close he had come to losing everything that now mattered to him. When the children returned, they flung themselves at him and Katherine with such fierce relief that Mason felt his carefully constructed emotional walls crumble completely. Later that evening, with Katherine's leg splinted and bandaged, the damaged porch extinguished, and the children finally asleep after their ordeal, Mason sat beside Katherine's bed. She was pale but alert, her hand resting in his. "I thought I'd lost you," he admitted quietly. "When I saw the smoke and couldn't find you, I thought of the children," Katherine replied, "and of you. I couldn't bear the thought of never seeing any of you again." Mason lifted her hand to his lips, pressing a gentle kiss to her knuckles. "I meant what I said before, Katherine. I want you to stay, all of you, forever." Katherine studied his face in the lamplight. "Even though I can't give you children of your own, I have everything I need right here," Mason said with absolute certainty. "If you'll have me." Instead of answering directly, Katherine beckoned him closer. When he leaned in, She raised her free hand to his cheek and guided his lips to hers in a tender kiss that conveyed everything words could not. When they parted, both smiling shyly, a small voice came from the doorway. "Does this mean we're staying forever now?" They turned to see James standing there in his nightshirt, his hair tousled from sleep. Mason opened his arm and the boy ran to him, climbing onto his lap. "Would you like that, James?" Katherine asked gently. "If we stayed here with Mason forever," James nodded emphatically. "Forever and ever." He looked up at Mason with solemn eyes. "Can I call you Pa? Thomas says I shouldn't because you're not really our Pa, but I want to." Mason felt his throat tighten with emotion. "I'd be honored, James," he managed to say. "Nothing would make me prouder." "Good," James said decisively. "Because I already told Starlight you were my Pa, and I don't want to make her confused." Katherine laughed, her eyes bright with tears. "Well, we certainly can't confuse the horses." Mason gathered James closer, marveling at how completely his life had transformed. "No, we certainly can't," he agreed, his heart fuller than he'd ever thought possible. 2 months later, on a crisp January morning in 1876, Mason and Katherine were married in the Las Vegas church, with Thomas, Sarah, and James standing proudly beside them. The townsfolk who had once whispered about their unusual arrangement now celebrated the union of the respected rancher and the beloved schoolteacher. Sheriff Parsons, serving as Mason's best man, leaned in during the reception. "Never thought I'd see the day," he remarked with a grin. Mason Vance, family man. Mason watched as James showed off his new boots to anyone who would look, as Sarah helped serve cake with ladylike grace, and as Thomas stood tall and proud in his first proper suit. Finally, his gaze settled on Katherine, radiant in her cream-colored wedding dress, her leg healed enough that she had walked down the aisle with only the slightest limp. "Neither did I," Mason admitted. "But life has a way of giving you what you need, even when it's not what you thought you wanted." "Pa," James called excitedly, running to Mason's side. "Mr. Prescott says I can ride one of his ponies next week. Can I, please?" Mason lifted the boy into his arms, still marveling at the title that had once seemed forever out of his reach. "We'll see, son," he said, the word feeling perfectly right on his lips. "We'll see." Katherine joined them, slipping her arm through Mason's free one. "What's this about ponies?" "Just making plans," Mason told her with a smile, "for our future." "Our future," she echoed, her eyes shining with happiness. "I like the sound of that." As they stood together, a family created not by blood but by love and circumstance, Mason knew with absolute certainty that the dream he'd thought lost forever had simply been waiting for him in a different form. The house he'd built for ghosts was now filled with life, laughter, and the promise of tomorrow. And when, 3 years later, the town doctor confirmed what seemed impossible, that Katherine was expecting a child, Mason counted it as just one more miracle in a life that had become rich with them. Thomas, now apprenticed to the town carpenter but still living at the ranch, crafted a perfect cradle. Sarah, blossoming into a young woman with dreams of becoming a teacher like Katherine, sewed tiny garments with careful stitches. And James, inseparable from his beloved Starlight and proudly helping Mason train the ranch's horses, solemnly promised to be the best big brother ever. Mason would always remember the doctor's amazed explanation that his condition, while permanent in most cases, had somehow resolved itself. "Medical mysteries happen, Mr. Vance," the doctor had said. "Sometimes the body heals in ways we don't understand." But Mason understood perfectly. His heart had healed first, making room for a family he never expected, and somehow his body had followed suit. The baby girl born that autumn they named her Hope was just one more blessing in a life that had taught Mason Vance that family came in many forms. and that love, once given room to grow, could overcome even the most seemingly insurmountable obstacles. On Hope's christening day, as Mason stood with Katherine beside him, their 4 children gathered close. He remembered that fateful day when a small boy had first called him Pa. It had been the beginning of everything, proof that sometimes the dreams we abandon make way for even greater ones we never dared to imagine.